And yeah, this is the first time we've done anything like this. Normally, at Rebel Wisdom, we're a media channel, and we also run a lot of in-person events. And it's only obviously circumstantially and quite recently that we've started doing a lot on Zoom, and have actually found that the level of depth we can get to is really surprising, and it can be a really wonderfully connecting experience. So I hope that with all the things we have on offer today, that's your experience as well. So wanted to just begin a little bit about just kind of checking in with where we find ourselves right now, as what we could say kind of as a species, or as many different people. You know, we are all, for the first time in a very long time, all focused in the same direction in some way, and all in a similar experience. And a lot of the people we've been speaking to on the channel have talked about that we're in a liminal space. So we're in this space really between worlds. And the word liminal actually comes from the Latin limen, which is the threshold. So this place that divides two things. The word threshold in English is the name that comes from just the name of the doorway to our homes. And we have literally stepped through a threshold into a liminal space, a space kind of between worlds, but we've stepped through our own thresholds into our homes. And so that's where I presume almost all of us are calling in from, is our home. So we've gone into this very familiar place in this incredibly unfamiliar situation. And so I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that, and acknowledge the difficulty of these times as well. You know, and this event is called Resilience and Sensemaking. And the reason we chose those two topics, or those two things to really look at today, is because both of those feel very, very important right now. Resilience is our ability to be in the world and to navigate the stressors of the world and still keep our center and still keep our strength. It doesn't mean that we don't find anything difficult. It just means that we have more staying power. And then sense making is our ability to make sense of reality and to make sense of what's going on. And as we were talking about those concepts, we started to realize that they're actually really closely linked together. Because if we don't know how to place ourselves in the world and have at least some sense of where we are, where things are moving, it's very anxiety, or can be very anxiety inducing, and it can really affect our resilience. At the same time, if we're not feeling connected to ourselves, and we're not taking some care of our nervous system and grounding ourselves in some way, looking after ourselves, then we actually start to see the world differently. We know, and some of the facilitators we have today will be giving you a lived experience of this. You know, our nervous system state really radically changes how we perceive the world. So if we want to sense make clearly and calmly, it really serves us to be connecting with these practices. So I'm going to briefly go through the structure of the day before handing over to David, who'll talk a little bit more about Rebel Wisdom and where we are right now. But it's a day of both sense making and resilience. This first part is really the sense making part. So we have Jamie Wheal and Diane Musho Hamilton, who are going to be giving us a bit of a bigger picture, and we'll be trying to do a little bit of that ourselves as well. And then at about 6 p.m. GMT, we'll be opening up the other two rooms. So there'll be 3 rooms with different practices on offer. And I'll talk a little bit later in this section about what those practices are and why we've chosen all of those. But just broadly, we're doing practices that first help us connect to ourselves and to center in ourselves and to grow our own resilience. And then we're going to some practices which are more around connecting to our bodies and starting to move a little bit, starting to come into a flow and a rhythm. And then we're moving out into, okay, well, what does it look like when we start coming together as a community? And what are the things that we need to know about that? What are the things that can help us with that? And then we'll also be looking at how do we relate to one another on a deeper level, and who are we as we relate? And so we're trying to give as broad a spectrum as we can. And of course, there's always practices and theories that we're going to leave out. But our hope is that wherever you're at in your own experience of this crisis, there'll be something at least that really connects with you, and you think, okay, I really need a bit more of this in my life right now. And so hopefully there'll be something on offer. So I'm going to hand over to David to talk a little bit more about Rebel Wisdom, where we're going and where we've been, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. Yeah, there's quite a few familiar faces here and a lot of new faces as well. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a background for Rebel Wisdom for maybe some people who haven't been following so closely the films that we've been putting out and the events that we've been doing. So my background, I'm a journalist and filmmaker. I worked for the BBC and for Channel 4 for about 15 years. But I studied philosophy at university, and I was always really interested in I was always sort of interested in slightly bigger ideas than I was able to get across in the films that I was making for kind of the mainstream media. But I was always interested in what are the like pressure points in society? What are the areas where we can see that the way that we're looking at the world and the way we're understanding the world are not really fit for purpose? Where is a sort of deeper understanding required? And I kind of followed that. So I've always been really interested in big ideas, and I tended to sort of gravitate towards stories that I felt were kind of looking at those sort of crux points. For example, psychedelic therapy back in about 2008, circular economy, sustainability, that sort of thing. But at the same time, I was doing a lot of personal growth work and a lot of transformational work, and thinking about how the inner and the outer really sort of are two parts of the same coin. That a lot of the problems that we're dealing with in the world are to do with the kind of people that we are, the kind of way that we're looking at the world, and how do those things fit together? How do the sort of inner and the outer fit together? Which kind of led me towards integral theory and a lot of sort of developmental models. Like, what kinds of people are we, and how are we being challenged by the times to kind of become different kinds of people? And in particular, I was always very interested in sort of where the cultural conversation is right now. And there was really this sense, especially with the kind of new atheists, like the Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, which were a really valuable lens for looking at the world, but also felt like they were kind of missing something as well. Like, it was a very reductive view of human nature. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, I started by making a documentary about Jordan Peterson and his sort of really deep mythopoetic way of looking at the world, and what are the deep stories of Western culture that are potentially not really being seen, not really being kind of understood. And so I followed that thread with Jordan Peterson, and then kind of in the end, Rebel Wisdom came from that first film. And then there was a sort of period of following, okay, where is the emergent in the culture? Where are the new thinkers? Where is this sense of emergence and excitement? And I sort of, really felt kind of drawn to, firstly, obviously Jordan Peterson, then the kind of intellectual dark web thinkers, and then more into some of the developmental thinkers. So Ken Wilber and the integral theory, and then sort of Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jamie Wheal, who will be joined by very soon. And just this sense of, okay, where is the new and emergent in the culture? And most of those thinkers, most of the really interesting thinkers, I think, brought this real lens of outer systemic fragility and the need for systems change, and how, as Daniel Schmachtenberger would say, we're actually potentially in a self-terminating system. But then this real understanding of, okay, what are the changes that we need to make in our own lives and in ourselves to respond to this? And I think, obviously, the crisis that we are probably only in the early stages of now, I think makes all of that much more current, much more obvious, I think, to many people that something is quite fundamentally wrong with the structures that we have and the way that we're being sort of stress tested by this crisis, the medical crisis, and then the economic crisis. So I'd quite like to play the film that we made over 2 years ago now. And this was the sort of the original Channel film.
As the tech revolution continues to destroy old media, the internet is fueling a new intellectual awakening.
Television made people look stupider than they were. It turns out that people are smarter with longer attention spans than we thought.
I'm a journalist and filmmaker. For many years I made documentaries for the likes of the BBC and Channel 4.
But I don't think the mainstream media can provide the level of analysis and insight we need for the extraordinary times we're going through. where the old structures that made sense of the world break down.
It's like we're just entering into the underworld, and it's a descent. We're feeling everything starting to shake, and the center cannot hold.
And when our ways of thinking break down, it's the rebels and the renegades who dare to think differently who are needed to reboot the system.
Right, so what's happening is that people are perceiving, because it's becoming increasingly obvious, that all of these artifacts of the way that we've gone about doing civilization are breaking down and failing in a way that is no longer easy to pretend isn't happening. And so as a consequence, this triggers a deep visceral sense. And that's a good thing, right? Because that deep visceral sense is the return to the liminal, the return to the mystery.
The shift that we are on the precipice of is not like the shift from the Dark Ages to the Enlightenment. It's more like a shift from single cell to multicellular life.
These are the people and ideas Rebel Wisdom is searching out to try to make sense of the growing chaos.
Evolution screwed up. It handed us the tools to recognize that we don't have to value the game that it is playing, and that we can now repurpose the hardware to something that's actually worthwhile.
That's what I actually have hope in, is that if enough people can come to that realization, then we wake up, and not in some bullshit evangelical megachurch kind of way of being born again, but in a truly initiatory way, being born again, of I know my purpose, I know my part, and I'm willing to practice resurrection. I'm willing to offer my life fully and freely, in love, in every moment. And then we're invincible. Then we can turn things on a dime.
It's also about trying to create a new form of conversation, one based on genuine dialogue, letting go of ideology and fixed ideas.
So we want to be a place that hosts this new form of conversation, both online and at our events. Check out our films, join the conversation.
Yeah, so as I said, I watched that again recently with kind of fresh eyes. I think definitely this sort of sense of the descent, and that a lot of the things that a lot of the people on the channel have been talking about for a very long time, especially existential risk and systemic fragility, are now really coming to the fore. And I think a lot of these, we were actually recording a piece today, a really interesting piece about complexity thinkers, and how from the beginning of this crisis, a lot of the complexity thinkers were one of the first to really recognize what was going on and recognize the possibility for it to affect so many of the other systems. They had a real sense of the interdependence of all of our systems, and how a fragility in one place might show up as with consequences elsewhere. And so this is a film we're going to put out probably in the next week or so. And this sense that it started with a virus, but in a way it could have been anything. If we had such a fragile system, that any shock to that system could have created a lot of the cascading effects that we're now seeing. And this sense that we also talked about how this is a kind of unveiling of a lot of the reality of who we are as a society, and probably who we are as individuals as well. And it's also a time for building on that resilience as well, resilience societally and resilience individually. And so this is what we're going to be doing through the day today, is some individual practices for building resilience, and also building community resilience, and potentially moving beyond that into kind of what are the things that as a society we need to look at. Could this be, it's a crisis, but could it be an opportunity as well? And could it be an opportunity for some kind of shift into a different way of being? And this is also the reason we've called it Sensemaking and Resilience, is because those two things, what we've realized following the kind of thread of the channel and the people that we've spoken to over the last couple of years, is that those two things are absolutely intertwined. That we perceive from a place of an embodied place. So if we're feeling off center, if we're feeling nervous, or if we're feeling in panic or being overwhelmed, then we're not able to perceive. So it's also this sense of, and it goes the other way as well, that if we can make sense of what's going on, if we can understand maybe the deeper patterns, the deeper shifts that might be happening, then we also won't get knocked off center, because in some ways we'll actually say, okay, maybe this is a process that had to happen. This is a process, and then we're at least a couple of steps further down than people who are just being overwhelmed by the immediacy of like the day to day. And there was this sense from the beginning of this crisis, certainly in the calls that we had with our members, the people, I guess, who'd been watching a lot of the content, that they weren't actually that surprised. There was some sense of, yeah, we knew this was going to happen. We knew something like this was going to happen. And this sense of maybe possibility alongside the overwhelm and the concern about what it might mean. So, yeah, I'm going to hand over to Ali to talk a bit more about kind of the embodied process and what we're going to do later on.
Yeah, so actually since the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, we've always had a focus on how do we live the ideas that we're exploring in the films, because it's one thing to know something conceptually, but it's very, very different to really bring it into our lives. And it feels very much that to get through what we're facing and to, let's say, become new types of people in response to a new type of environment, we have to start training ourselves to perceive differently and to, need a whole new skill set. So my background is I'm trained as a meditation instructor, and I used to have a meditation school in London, teaching people how to meditate really. And then as I got deeper into the world of, I suppose, self-development, I became also interested in, well, how do we, what are the ways we can do that in groups? So I became very interested in group work, trained as a counselor. And so I've always had a very deep fascination with the way in which we develop as adults. And I know that a lot of people on the call will probably be familiar with developmental theory and Ken Wilber, etc. And this is the idea that we don't just, hit, say, age 19 or 20, and then we're just a fully fledged adult and we're good to go, and then we go off. I think most people have an experience that says realities and our lives are very different to that. We keep growing and learning. And another, we talked about myth a little bit before, and like what's the kind of mythic landscape we find ourselves in. Myth is another, and storytelling is another place we see that. We see that characters go on a journey of being less to being more, to having a smaller worldview, to having a bigger worldview. And I think that's a big part of these practices, is that it expands out how much we can hold at the same time. And, for me, I see this situation as one really where so many things are true at the same time. It's scary and it's uncertain and it's an opportunity, and it's a million other things for us simultaneously. So I think one thing these practices do is they just expand our ability to hold many things at once. And they also tap us into different ways of knowing the world. So we've talked about this on the channel a few times, that we often know the world, or culture often knows the world, through some pretty narrow ways of knowledge. So what John Vervaeke, who's a cognitive scientist we've had on a few times, he calls it propositional knowing. So knowing that. But where we are right now is in a situation where knowing that isn't really going to cut it. We need to just tap into this more, or it might serve us to tap into this more embodied, flowing way of knowing, and access information that we only really get through experience, that we can't kind of read our way to. We can't read our way through becoming new types of humans. We have to practice it. So what we've tried to do today is bring in lots of different practices that tap into different areas. So we have, at 6 o'clock, we have practices that really tap us into ourselves and how we connect to ourselves and how we see the world and how we kind of center ourselves. And then we're moving beyond that into movement, to really come in, to not forget we have bodies, which is very easy to do when we're on screens, even more than we were before. Moving then into how do we build community with one another, which is a really big theme of today and a very important one. And then from there into how do we relate to each other and how do we relate to ourselves. So I'm just very briefly going to share the schedule to just run through and introduce everyone to some of our wonderful facilitators. And I'm going to have to pull up. Oh, bear with me 1 second. This is the joys of doing something on Zoom. So Google Chrome. And just raise or give a thumbs up if you can see a schedule in front of you on your screen there. Hey, wonderful. So I'm going to scroll down to the practices. What we're going to have after this, we're shortly going to introduce Jamie Wheal and Diane Musho Hamilton. And then Tom Morley, who some of you saw at the beginning, is the man with a tremendous amount of drums behind him, who you might be able to see, is going to take us through a kind of participatory musical experience to end this main session. But 6 to 7 is the sovereignty meditation with myself. And then we have Trish Blaine, and we're going to introduce all of our facilitators, or give them a chance to introduce themselves in a bit more detail a little bit later on. So Trish Blaine's going to be running a session called Creating Coherence. We have Karen Downs, who's going to be running a session called Coming to Our Senses. And then we have Carl Thor doing yoga and movement. And we have Roger Jackson running a session about understanding your nervous system. And Tom Morley getting into flow in lockdown. So that will involve making lots of noise and many other wonderful things. Then we have Nicola Price, who's going to be doing inspirational breathing. So breathwork is a tremendously powerful practice that myself and David have gotten a lot out of, I know. We have Richard Bartlett, who's going to be focused on community building. How do we build community in times like this and in general? And then we have Sarah Ness, who will be giving a session on authentic relating, which is really a way of relating to each other, which is beyond just the way we tell stories to each other, and really tapping into a deeper level. So as well as that, Sarah will be holding a skills and needs market in the next session. And that's an opportunity for people to really share skills and needs. And it could be very practical things. And it could be be something that you can offer that you feel could be really useful for someone. And we're going to do our best to, after that, what we're going to do is help connect people and have a spreadsheet where people can connect, probably geographically, which will be easiest. And while that's going on, we also have Diane Musho Hamilton, who's going to be in this introductory session as well. And she's going to be talking about relating in lockdown, which is a really key theme because many of us are now in the same place as our loved ones for an extended period of time. And it's becoming, it's really important to figure out how do we relate to one another well. And then also on a similar thread, we have Rafi and Morgan talking about autonomy in lockdown and elsewhere, because of course it doesn't just apply. How to kind of stay connected to our own autonomy as individuals applies all throughout life. And like many things, it's been really heightened by this crisis. And then the very last session, David and I will just wrap things up and close. So I'm just going to pull out of there. So yeah, we're gonna introduce Jamie in a moment, and it's a little bit synchronous really, because we had Jamie over. Jamie was over in London and ran a couple of really popular workshops in London, and was talking about a lot of the themes that that we're going to be covering today, actually. And also there was Tom Morley and Carl Thor, who are here today. So it's somewhat of a small reunion. So I'll hand over to David to introduce Jamie.
Yeah, I'm just going to introduce Jamie and just play a short clip from the workshop that we did in London. And something that just wanted to make clear as well, because I think some people have been asking in the chat, that we're recording these sessions. We're not recording we're recording speaker view basically. So we're putting out the recordings of us talking. We won't be putting out any of the sessions themselves. So the sessions won't be recorded. They're private, and we won't be putting out anything like the gallery view. So it will just be us. That's why we're recording, so that we can put it out for people who couldn't join the call. Cool. So yeah, just going to introduce Jamie. So as Ali said, we ran these workshops with Jamie in London in October, which were called Collective Sensemaking in an Age of Existential Risk, and now seem very prescient and very timely. So I'm just going to play a quick clip from those workshops now.
But it is to say, hey, we're in a shared project here of how do we get this done. So I'm just going to share some potential assertions. I want to make very clear that's all they are. You are absolutely free to agree, disagree, challenge, refine, iterate. Okay, but this is just kind of, again, to the laying the cards. The first is that things are likely to destabilize before they recohere. It's coming, anyway. Right? Your vortex is about to be overwhelmed by a tsunami. So this is Sun Tzu, better to be a warrior in the garden than a gardener in the war. So we're still in our gardens, we're blessed. For now, amen. Right? Train. I don't give a damn about the happy thoughts on this side of facing the facts. I would give my life for the joy on the other side of facing the facts.
So yeah, I think we'd all agree that now seems like a very prescient training that Jamie gave last October. And yeah, for those who aren't familiar with Jamie is the creator of the Flow Genome Project. So his passion has been group flow states and has been really kind of interested in, he was also part of the Integral Institute for many years. So has been sort of plowing this furrow of kind of adult development. How do we become different kinds of humans to deal with the problems of the world? And since the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, I found a really profound alignment between Jamie's vision and view of the world and the path that he's trodden and what we've been trying to do with Rebel Wisdom. So I'm very grateful that Jamie has agreed to come and be part of this and to give us a little bit of a situation report, sort of like a bird's eye view of where we're at, of a sense making, to sort of make sense of the situation that we find ourselves right now. And I think if Jamie is there amongst all of these places, yay. Hey, Jamie.
Hey, everyone. All right, shall I take it from here? Fantastic. And Ali, just if anyone's getting a little freaked out, you always know that, Ali can still bring fabulous hair to the Apocalypse game.
You know how hard it is to find a hairdresser?
David, I think you got to up your beard game here. Something's happening. And that was also a really wonderful initial film that you saw, because that's literally our whole crew of friends. So the beginning fellow that was talking about the liminal space was Jesse Estrin. He was a student of ours when he was in high school. We were his mountain guides. And then all the way through Brett and Jordan and Daniel, and then going forwards into Di. I mean, this is literally the people we hang out with when we're not doing talky things. So there's deep, deep love and connection and commitment shared between that whole community of folks. Ali and David asked me to just do some kind of frame up setup sort of things. And so hopefully this can kind of tee up the day a bit, maybe also just kind of fill in some blanks for anybody. I mean, there's a large number of people here, so we're not going to presume any particularly high level of shared knowledge, but also don't want to repeat the things that are on everybody's social feeds and we're all kind of scrolling through. So with that, and normally I love to show pretty pictures and slides and things like that, but this is a little kind of just hot off the presses. So I'm just, I jotted down some notes yesterday and would love to just kind of share from there if that works. So with that said, I've sort of say a situational assessment of where are we now and what on earth is going on would be kind of a decent, simple frame. And would love to kind of break it into three categories. Basically first order effects. What is the actual, biology of this virus thing that happens to be going around? The second order effects, because of that, what else is also happening or about to happen or potentially happening? And then third order effects, what does the world look like after we make it through this and whatever format we do? And what does that transition look like? So first, second, and third order effects. So we'll start with the first order stuff. What is actually going on with the coronavirus? And again, I'm going to try and stay in my lane, which will be, I'm not going to pretend to be an armchair epidemiologist. I'm going to try and speak as much as possible from direct experience or from the actual, basically the sense-making side of things. What are frameworks or ways to look at stuff versus holding forth on things that are actually a technical expertise. So the first one is obviously everyone's trying to figure out, how bad is this thing? And that usually boils down to how close is it to familiar reference points? And the obvious one is influenza. And quite quickly we've gone down back to Spanish flu, 1918 to 1920. And, how's that? Or how does this compare to kind of annual flu these days? And so the two, sort of fancy pants terms that get thrown around a lot these days, which you're probably all familiar with as of, the last 3 weeks, is R naught and CFR, or case fatality rate. Because if we have a sense of how viral it is, which is the R naught factor, and or how many people actually end up dying, then we can kind of level set. We can go like, okay, well, if we have, and in the US, the numbers are somewhere between sort of 15,000 flu-related fatalities a year, all the way up to 60 or 7 to 75 in a really bad year. We're like, okay, well, we deal with that, and the wheels don't come off civilization. And so, is it the same as that? Is it how many more times worse than that? What do we think? And the simplest thing, if you've been looking into any of the studies, is that the really long and the short is we have no idea yet. Every single model starts with different baseline assumptions, different data sets of different populations, and then comes to potentially wildly variant conclusions. And if you were in the UK and you were looking at the differences between the Imperial College studies that prompted the abrupt turnaround, the Boris Johnson, or the Oxford studies that were saying, hey, maybe more than half of this of UK is already infected, and back and forth, and there were similar ones coming out of Stanford and other places, it's very much kind of shit or go blind territory. Were you focusing specifically on Wuhan? Were you focusing on all of China? Were you focusing on a cruise ship? Were you focusing on all of Italy or Northern Italy, or that one little town in Italy that tested everybody, or, right? And so the simplest is to say is that R naught, meaning how, and CFR, neither of them are fixed constants. They don't just exist. We're never going to get to a specific number, because it's basically, R naught is a sort of three-legged stool, which is, the first is just the biology of the virus itself. So how viral is it? The next is the biology of the people it comes in contact with. So how healthy are you? How old are you? Do you have any comorbidity? All those kinds of things. And then the third, which is the real doozy, is kind of culture, which, if, for any of you integral nerds out there, we're just going to collapse, lower right and lower left into culture, but it's the crazy shit humans do, right? If and how we behave has everything to do with how infectious things become. And so there's the question of, sheltering in places and quarantines versus going to big concerts and parties. You've all seen the Florida spring break stuff. And even on the technological side, if you think about it, for all intents and purposes, Germany and the United States share almost identical sort of techno-economic medical structures, healthcare systems. They're equally advanced societies. Our cultural responses are as polar opposite as they could be, which is then in turn affecting R naught and affecting CFR. So we can kind of see how this whole thing works out. And, it will take a long time and a lot of controversial academic backing and forthing going forwards to really sort this. Now, that said, I would imagine, and I would not assert this as anything resembling a fact, but here's my sort of, here's my guess, which is that I think by the time it's all truly said and done, that case fatality rates will end up being somewhere between 0.5% and 1%. That they are over-indexed right now for all the obvious reasons you're probably familiar with, which is testing is limited. The people who get tested tend to be highly, they've already come to hospitals, or already have acute diseases. The asymptomatic folks, the mild symptoms are sort of not in the data set yet. And that by the more data we gather, the more those numbers will likely be coming down, barring wild ass crazy things like overwhelm of health systems and that kind of stuff. That doesn't necessarily do much for us, because most of the models, the modeling is kind of moot as the wave just goes through. So simultaneously, we're looking at something that is not as bad as everyone was afraid of, potentially, right? If you talk about sort of coming down below 1% CFR over, global blended over time. And at the same time, worse than we feared as far as the impacts as this first wave rolls through. And that is a little confusing and crazy making. How can both sides be right and both sides be partial, and we're still just dealing with physical reality happening? And then also think social media, real-time news, if it bleeds, it leads, all the amplifying effects of how we're experiencing this. So that's just kind of a sense, is that it's probably this first wave is going to be more acute and more intense. And by the way, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I think the UK is in a similar boat to the US, but I can for sure say for the US is likely in for about the worst possible version of this we could be, which is largely on us. So we are going to get all of the detriments of quarantining, meaning the collapse of market economy, social pressures, et cetera, with virtually none of the benefits. We will probably end up with 80% plus of just, if we just wandered into this fatality and overwhelm, and we will get all of the economic downsides and none of the biological benefit. So we are going to be somewhere in the Italy to Iran territory. And we were just on a call 2 days ago with Dr. David Nabarro, who's heading up the UN's response to this. And his numbers were something along the lines of a 2.5 day doubling rate, which is, if you've seen any of the charts, and they usually have dotted lines, like, here's 3 day doubling rate, here's 4 day doubling rate, here's 5 day doubling rate. 2.5 is, more, is steeper and gnarlier and more consequential as you compound things. So yeah, we're likely in it. And a lot of it is just absolute and utter mismanagement. And so without giving away too much, like, we're on daily calls. I was just on a call with Daniel until midnight last night. He is deep into influencing governors, White House, federal government, coordinating epidemiological responses with Stanford, Harvard, MIT, Jordan, and I and a handful of former SEAL Team 6 special operations community are actively working on responsiveness efforts. So like, we are way in this right now. The breakdown as to what's happening, at least in the US response, is acute, like worse than what is showing up in the news. And to the point where even like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US, is now balkanized at the regional level. And the states are not sharing data because they're concerned that the federal government is going to abuse or misuse it, and then either force them to do things they don't want to do, or tell them, as has happened with Governor Cuomo in New York, you don't actually need all the ventilators you say you're needing them. So it is creating a perfect storm of human culture and dysfunction and politicking on top of the perfect storm of, this sort of, flat-footed virus response. So that's the kind of high level on first order. The simplest is this is neither the first nor the last. And so we need to be thinking of this in the long term. What is the likely nature of ongoing epidemics and infections? You guys have all probably seen the thawing of permafrost, the releasing of things in the poles. There's a lot of creepy crawlies and buried things that are, that are going to be exposed and amplified as a result of climatic shifts and environmental degradation. And at the same time, there's also the folks in the labs, doing expansion of function kind of work. So the likelihood that we will be managing things like this in the future versus this just being an utter one-off black swan is actually, fairly solid. So we should be anticipating that. And then there's the sense of so if we said that this first wave is simultaneously not as bad and worse or more acute than we were thinking, the other thing to think of is it's only a first wave. And so what is happening with second and third waves, meaning reinfections, the population, whether that's seasonal, like spring to autumn, and or whether that's just a globally connected society and people bumping into each other and starting to travel again and being asymptomatic carriers. And we're seeing that in Singapore and Hong Kong and South Korea, those sort of things. So the questions there is and by the way, are you guys talking? Because I see your lips moving. Do we have audio? No, you're okay. Okay. And so what to do with that and what are the impacts on basically civil society is an open question. And so, I was talking with one of our friends and the thought is that somewhere mid to late summer, there might be a sort of seventh inning stretch, which is a baseball term, but the idea of like you're sitting in the stands, everybody's sitting there, their bums hurt. And then there's the seventh inning and everybody kind of gets up and shakes it out and moves around a bit. And we might get this kind of brief, God knows what, 4 to 12 week sort of opening. And for anybody that found themselves not in the ideal spot when the music just stopped, You're sitting on someone's lap, you're on a bar stool, not a chair, you're sitting on the floor, and you're like, okay, now I know exactly where I want to be longer term. There might be this kind of frenetic shuffle before any secondary or tertiary waves happen, and we end up in some form of whatever we would call, stabilized long-term, international management of this thing. So that's kind of bucket number one. There's obviously infinite amounts more to talk about, but I just kind of want to hopefully level set and normalize those things. Bucket number two is what else is happening as a result of this. And this is a very non-technical image, but I always think of like Empire Strikes Back, where those big giant, they look like dinosaurs. They're those called AT-ATs, and they're like going through the snow. And then the rebels, they spin around them with the cable, and they trap the legs, and then it goes kadoosh, 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 and then like 5 steps, and then smashes into the ground. And like that kind of feels like our civilization right now. And Corona is just a little X-wing fighter with a little cable behind it, just wrapping the legs. And so it's not, it's not an atom bomb from the Death Star. It is just the thing that tips the bigger thing, and it slowly comes down to its knees. And so what we're seeing is this as a potential trigger event of metasystemic complexity. Right. And fragility, which isn't wildly surprising. And Jordan has done a great job. He wrote a Medium article that was kind of summing up our collective work and thinking about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I think it was situational assessment, something like now, or what is happening right now. Is that right? Yeah. So check that out if you haven't. It kind of lays out this kind of bucket too, the sort of knock-on effects. But just a couple of things to be paying attention to. So this week in the US, there was a lot of noise around, oh my God, 6 million jobless claims. Oh my God, like here's what's happened to the economy. The economy has contracted this much, and this is actually, what it was 5 times more than 2008. It was now 6 to 10 times. It was the worst since, the 1929 kind of crash, those sort of things. But something to note there, if that wasn't disheartening enough, is to note that actually all those numbers, they take those numbers from the 12th of every month. So those numbers are actually a trailing indicator of what was happening up to March the 12th. Nothing fucking happened in the United States until the March 15th, 16th. So that's while the wheels were still happily on the bus, and it was already crashing that hard. We don't get what's actually we've just lived through, meaning the second half of March into the first half of April. We don't get that until May. So we know that is coming. We know that is massively worse than any of the data points we've currently got. And when that hits public consciousness, now it's already happened, it's just when it hits public consciousness, it is going to create a stark raving shit show, which, could have some good in it. It could loosen federal purse strings. It could prompt them to, print more monopoly money. Who knows? But that hasn't hit yet, although it is already registered in the real world. The next is something to pay attention to is that in that $4 trillion bailout in the US, there was no addressing of the mortgage markets. And there was actually, I think on one Monday, they pumped, I don't know what it was, 50 billion into the mortgage markets, and it literally changed the mortgage because they were trying to prop that up, and it basically changed rates for 4 minutes. The rates went down for 4 minutes, and then all the banks were like, no, we're not going to spend any of that money, jack the fees, make this impossible. And the next thing to watch for is no one can afford rent. So there's questions as to whether there's going to be rent, basically there's just people reneging on that. That happens, and questions for rent forgiveness and kind of compassionate things as well. But it doesn't really matter. Let's just say, all the tenants say, hey, we're hard up, and this can be businesses as well, small businesses. This can be residential. They say, hey, we're really in a tight spot. We can't pay rent. We don't have any income, business or personal. Then all the landlords say, let's just say they all say, okay, that's fine. We're in this too. We forgive you. And then the banks say, hey, owners, we need your mortgage payment. They say, look, this is the trickle down thing. We're doing the right thing. We can't give you any money. And then the banks actually have to pay on their bundled mortgages. So what we are likely going to see, absent some not yet done, completely amazing, absolutely high octane bailout specifically for the mortgage industry, is a complete and utter freezing of the mortgage credit and debt markets by middle to late Q2. And that is, so basically we're getting trickle up economics, not trickle down. And that is something to really note and pay attention to. And something that happened last week, which again, people probably aren't noticing, is that the Fed, the Federal Reserve in the US, printed tons and tons of money, and the Treasury is buying it all. And basically behind the scenes, what has happened is that the Treasury has had an unprecedented takeover of financial control and power. And this is something that's not showing up in the news much at all, but it's probably one of the more structural and systemic power plays that is literally changing the landscape. And they put it all into special purpose vehicles and kept it outside of the bank's purview. So unlike the TARP bailouts and things like that in 2008, which was very hand in glove, it was basically lots of corporate bailouts to the banks and propping them up. This is now oppositional. So we have a fracturing at the highest level of the financial market, and you're now having hidden special purpose vehicles with very little oversight from the banks. And now the banks and this move from the Fed and the Treasury are now oppositional, and there's a knife fight for power and control of the economic markets. And again, there's one piece in Bloomberg, I think, that mentioned this maybe 6 days ago. And other than that, it's pretty much under the radar, but just notice it and just, for sense making, just to put some pins in these maps. Be like, hey, I'm interested in 3 months from now, 4 months from now, if I start seeing things about the mortgage markets, I had a peg to hang that on. If I start seeing the sort of behind the scenes inside baseball of, Fed and Treasury and buybacks and who's owning paper and debt and those kinds of things, that's another one I've, pegged to notice. Interestingly, we may be, and Jordan Hall has spoken of this in the past, the idea of like, what is a debt jubilee? And a jubilee would just be where you sort of declare blanket amnesty for everybody. And, whether this is student loans or credit card debt or, whatever it would be. And can you actually create or, basically deliberately flatline the old system, just give everybody amnesty and then start a newer, better, more equitable one? And that was a very high concept, deep nerd, sort of anarchist war game idea for a long, long time. You're like, yeah, sure, that's fucking crazy. Like it's never going to happen. And blockchain and things like that created kind of some interest around how it might get done. It seems like we might be just heading there anyway, and there's no need to trigger a damn thing. And so, for instance, if you might not have seen this, but just last August, Chase, so one of the biggest global banks, just did that to all of the credit card holders in Canada. They just pulled out of the Canadian market, and they're like, "Hey, basically, whatever your balance is on your Chase credit card, fucking ain't good luck. You're free." And Canadians were shocked, and they were like, "What the hell?" And so this is not a small bank, and this is not a tiny country, and they basically just ran the numbers and were like, "It's going to cost us more to keep this business up and running and collect on all that outstanding consumer debt than it is just to write it off and walk away." So that's a small, not small example of what's possible. And for anybody that's, wondering how is it that the federal government just committed to pumping $1 trillion new dollars a month into the market, and you're like, well, where does that come from? And what does that actually mean about the nature of money? And like, I still have my house and my car, like those are real things. And there's like food in the fields, and that's real stuff. Like, what relationship does this increasingly abstracted financial market have to do with 3D matter? You're not wrong in asking. And I think there's going to be a number of folks that are as we explore what's happening here, there is a potential for some meaningful reboot of our relationship to credit and debt and ownership. Because when it really comes down to it, you're looking at, the old saying of possession is 9/10 of the law. So like, if and as the music stops, really, like, what do you actually have in your control is yours. And it doesn't matter whether you had 10,000 quid down on your car and you're making monthly payments, like who's coming to collect the car? And weren't they just wage owners as well? And like, at what point are they still employed? And at what point does that bank still exist? Like Lehman Brothers, like if you can take a 30-year mortgage out at this point, you're rolling the odds on, what are the odds that Wells Fargo still exists in 30 years? And what are the odds that that wage employee is going to risk their life to come and take your house back from you? So we're in a very, very curious place where suddenly like you're like, fuck my FICO credit score, you know, like I don't care anymore. And the dynamics of basically consumer debt and commercial debt are potentially up for grabs in a way that they haven't been in a long time. And McKinsey just put out a paper this week on the nature of recovery. And if you've heard Trump, and obviously most politicians would say, hey, we think it should be this shape. It should be a V-shaped recovery, which means we go rapidly down, which we've just done, at least as far as we have, and then rapidly back up. And the arguments for that you'll hear are, hey, nothing is fundamentally wrong. Our economy has been thriving along, 12-year bull market, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, the moment we can get out of our houses and back to work and back to shopping and all that kind of stuff, we're going to ping back to a very, very high top, all that pent up demand, et cetera. Right. The next option is a U-shaped recovery, which is you go down to the bottom, maybe as fast or maybe not quite as fast, and then it takes longer to come back. And that might be something like the 2008 to sort of 11, 12, you know, to never recovery that we've been in, right? So something that is more gradual on the recovery and a little bit more organic. And then finally, they lay out the options of the L-shaped recovery, where you drop down and you come out more like Greece, where you don't actually come back to the old, and you are now at a meaningful kind of step down based on the degradation of basically economic and market velocity and resiliency. Right? So those are the questions, is what shape are we in? And they obviously too soon to tell, but I would not rule out the L-shaped recovery. And that is basically like if we're asking like, where are we? And kind of what frameworks are helpful for us right now to sort of make sense of what can we expect. What are the things we're experiencing? Where do they live? You know, kind of what categories or what significance do they have? And then therefore, what might we predict or anticipate or get ready for that's coming? I think that the simplest, or at least the model that naturally comes up in my mind often these days is it's a little bit like hospice care. You know, it's a little bit like if you've ever cared for an aging parent or grandparent. And they're doing their thing and they're spry and they're happy. And then they fall and they break their hip, or they have, you know, a minor stroke or something, you know, there's some big scary thing that happens. And it's the sudden break from the way their life had been up until then. And you're scared and you're concerned, but they make it through that. But they don't get back to the old normal. They've had a step down. And then maybe they go into a nursing home or a hospital, and then something else happens. And then that's another big scare. And the family rallies around and they're like, oh my gosh, this could be it. And it's not. They actually come back, but they don't come back to to their old normal. They come back to better than that immediate crisis, but not as good as it ever was. And it's basically a series of step downs with crises and recoveries, but each one is lower and lower until finally it is their time to be done. Now, that's not to say that is what is, you know, that we are fixing to die, but it is to say that there's probably a series of ongoing crises with recoveries, but recoveries that don't come back V-shaped to the high go-go times. I mean, the capacity of us to go back to blowing and going, cheap credit, easy money, high margin, mass consumption, that one feels like a rearview mirror play to me. I would be shocked. And actually dismayed if we went back to that. That would feel like acute amnesia and entirely missing the point. But also, I don't even know if it's going to be structurally possible. Even if we wanted to just go, okay, we're just going to pretend none of this happened and let's all just pretend together. I don't even think that's actually going to be structurally possible. So just to get into the really concerning stuff, because this was all, I don't know what, this is just things that are happening versus conjectural things. So I'm doing my best to speak not to, like Daniel Schmachtenberger, for instance, is masterful at mapping all scenarios of all potential bads. He's like, you think we're fucked. Well, let me tell you, we are actually 17 shades and orthogonal 3-dimensional fucked. And here's all of them. And I personally, just coming out of like anthropology and history, tend to err on the side of like, what do we know is actually already happening? And this is a matter of just wrapping our heads around it versus what are additional hypotheticals that also might happen, simply because usually the cognitive and emotional load of what is happening is plenty. And if there's additional black swans, gnarly things, so be it, but let's not burn additional cycles on things that we can't from here say for sure. So that said, 2 bits of information. One came from Dr. Nabarro at the UN on Friday. The other came from a colleague at the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is Amory Lovin's sort of wizard sustainability institute in Aspen yesterday. And that is the knock-on effect. So now we're fully in the second order stuff. I've spent most of this time, the last 10 minutes, just describing basically, US, UK, political economic stuff. But as much as anything else, there are meaningful knock-on effects around the rest of the world. And one of the things that Dr. Nabarro was most concerned with was food shortage and civil unrest in places like Brazil, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, South Africa, and what is happening when you're forcing people who are day laborers, et cetera, to be quarantined, sheltered in place, unable to earn and unable to harvest. That has become massive. So let's just say that is true for the entire developing world. It is obviously hotspots are the favelas and super slums of Sao Paulo and other places in South America, et cetera. There are 2 additionally deeply concerning things, which is that if you haven't seen this, and you can't make this up, there is a biblical plague of locusts in Africa right now, and they are sweeping across the continent right at the same time as most of the continent is being forced into quarantine, which is stripping all the crops as people are unable to harvest and get the crops out of the fields and into storage. So when they emerge in 2 months, there will be nothing. In India, we just got a report yesterday that if you might have seen that Modi did that very abrupt lockdown, whenever it was, a week, 10 days ago. You've had massive migrations of all the day laborers out of the cities back to villages, just disruption, massive disruption and interruption of earning and sustenance. Their current crops, and this is as of yesterday, are rotting in the fields, and March is also the time where they're to be planting their long-term staple crops to keep them going through the rest of the year. Neither of those events is able to happen right now. So we are potentially at a place, if you just take the 2 continents of India and Africa, you're looking at potentially 2 billion humans at risk of acute food scarcity to potential famine within this agricultural year. And the other thing that Dr. Nabarro at the UN had said, he said, like all the NGOs that are normally kind of keeping the wheels on, aid camps and everything else, are all out of funding. Like everybody has stopped. So all the high-end philanthropists and billionaires and foundations have seen the collapse of their portfolios or endowments. They're either in personal scarcity, cover my ass mode. Whatever is happening at a systemic level. And all of the spigots, even for the pre-existing do-good organizations, is also massively contracted. So that is a brutal, brutal thing. And when we asked Nabarro what's needed, he said, we need 1,000 truth tellers around the world. He said, we need people to be able to stand up and communicate in a high trust, deeply authentic way what needs to be done. And that it's not enough to simply be sheltering in place, that we need to rally. I mean, it was interesting because the first half of his presentation was dry as fucking dust. And it was basically UN talking points. And we actually back channeled on a Zoom. We're like, hey, we're all, he's preaching to the choir here. We're all here to help. Let's get into the crux of stuff. And then he shifted. I said, what is this? What is the 3 points that we need to share? You mentioned this 1,000 truth tellers kind of thing. And he completely animated and changed. And it was, we need to rally our humanity. Like this is for real for all the marbles. And we have to empower local leaders. We have to stand up as communities. We have to take responsibility for our future and lead. And if you know what to do, you need to be leading. And this is a 70-year-old British doctor who oversaw Ebola and other things, was taken out of retirement and put back on the front lines to manage this because no one else knew how. And that kind of brings us to the third order effect, which is, okay, so we're having this wave one. It's both going to be sort of more acute and not as bad, weirdly, but there will be aftershock, subsequent waves. We will end up living with this much the same way we lived with the flu, right? And if you think about the Spanish flu, 1918, horrific. You think about last year's flu season, completely manageable. If you think about documentaries, if you've seen the early to mid 80s of the AIDS epidemic and hospitals in San Francisco and New York City and other things, horrific. Now, very manageable. So the idea is like you're caught with it. You don't know what it is. You don't know how to test for it. You don't know how to treat it. Overwhelming, right? Over time, we end up becoming integrated into our response, into our seasons, into our physiology, immunology, all those kinds of things, right? So that's what we're looking at on this level. And by the way, the more we can reduce the overwhelm and the effects of the actual infection, the more we mitigate all the second and third order effects too. And that was Daniel's insight on the call that he and I had last night. He said, so we are hell for leather on treatments to keep people out of ICUs to prevent overwhelm of hospital systems. Because we get that done, we lift quarantines, we reduce economic impact, we do the whole cascade, gets massively better if we can just do that thing up front. Okay, so now to the third order effects, which is what is this world we may be emerging into and what does it look like? And so the obvious things is global economic depression in a way that is far too soon to tell and far too complicated to map from here. But I think at a minimum, let's just think of V-shaped, U-shaped, L-shaped. We are almost certainly in an L-shaped recovery if we even get to kind of put that pin in the map. So what does that mean? And for any of us that had parents that came out of the war and grew up in 50s and 60s England, if you didn't, and you ever saw Pink Floyd's The Wall and you were like, wow, that's a bleak fucking album. What was that all about? Well, what that was about was growing up in, dirt poor, gardening, subsistence gardening, 50s England, that was a bombed out ruin. So like those kinds of like, how do we do this? And how do we find self-sufficiency and stability and joy? Those kind of things are going to be important, and they're going to be important around the world. There's a lot of us here. There's twice as many as were on this planet when I was born, and for most of that's crazy making. That's insane. The next is obviously nationalism and surveillance capitalism. So we've seen the fracturing of the New World Order. We've seen the fracturing of the neoliberal global order, and nationalism is intensifying right down to competition over supplies, which is not exactly being helped by the fearless leader in the U.S. That is going to, and then, the notion of testing, the notion of phone tracking and motions, which we're seeing this in South Korea, we're seeing this in Singapore, we're seeing this really as a necessary, test, track, manage. Like if we get out of the blunt instrument of shelter in place, the only solution that people are sort of seeing as possible is massive one-on-one contact tracing, tracking, and movement tracking, and temperature checking and surveillance, et cetera. So we can very end up in a Minority Report, Blade Runner kind of society. Daniel and others have been working on some interesting things with potentially Bluetooth-enabled random number generators that are anonymized, so that you could have preservation of privacy unless or until you test positive, and then it unlocks your contacts and only your contacts, but doesn't provide background information. That would be amazing if there's efforts that sort of protect civil liberties while also protecting the commons or the collective. Whether or not those are the things that get adopted at scale, whether or not those are the things that nation states choose, we shall see. You've also seen Bill Barr here in the US, head of judiciary, already lobbying for erosion of civil liberties, suspension of habeas corpus, all kinds of gnarly things, and nothing's even happened yet as far as civil unrest and those kind of things. So there needs to be real vigilance as to how do we respond to the emergency where everyone craves purity and security. Those are kind of two of like Jonathan Haidt's kind of like models of like what do we orient around. And so like impure stuff is seen as contamination and dirty and diseased, and it's the other. And then also security, we're often very willing to give away liberty for security in times of uncertainty. So paying real attention to that is going to be critical. And the other thing that I've just noticed is that it feels like if anybody has had their head kind of spun around by trying to make sense of all this, and the rate of change and the sort of crazy Christmas tree or spaghetti graph of like all the intersecting hypotheticals, it feels like in some ways this year or even this quarter has taken the next decade, 2020 to 2030, and it's just time compressed it. So we're seeing every hypothetical that Peter Diamandis and Ray Kurzweil and, like cheerleading futurists have said is possible. Jetpacks and immersive AR and Black Mirror, like in all of it that might come by 2030, and all the possibilities, ecological reboot, new shiny society, new way of working and being, all of it is suddenly in our windshield all at once because we've had a structural break with the inertia that was carrying us along. So that was like the sort of proverbial steer the aircraft carrier. And now the aircraft carrier is sort of blown up and we're all in life rafts. It's like, well, now where do we paddle? And think about Zoom. We're all on Zoom. We will not all be on Zoom in a year. Like whatever's happening with the fact that there's millions more people all interacting in this way and it matters, the intersection of that plus AR and VR and all these things, like that will be an accelerant. Right? The decrease in physical travel. There's so many things that are going to be structural adaptations. And we're going to see both the good and the bad of 2030 all in a jumbled reckoning as to which of those memes and which of those trends gets traction and prevails and steers us into kind of the new adjacent possible. So that's a fair amount of stuff. And I want to leave with the idea of what's the good point? Because, right, I mean, David, you kindly left with the idea of like, be joyful, though you have considered all the facts, right? And how do we do that? And how do we take these third order effects? What is the society? What is the civilization that we may be living into and shaping? And how do we honor Dr. Nabarro's, mandate or, cry for assistance here of being 1,000 truth tellers? What is that truth? Right. And I think that sense there is the mythopoetics. What is the story that helps us begin to remember? And I think at its simplest level, it is taking an a priori, just kind of ahead of time, deep commitment for shared humanity and common decency. And that sounds very underwhelming, but in this age of like fragmented, atomized, narcissistic, nihilistic consumers, or at least that's who we were a month ago, right? Actually saying, we are going to do the right thing. We are going to care for more than ourselves. We're going to extend our humanity as far as we possibly can. And not just me and mine, right? But me and mine and everyone, everywhere, everywhen. And can we take a stand for that? And here's the thing that I'm noodling on lately, which is, politics have fractured a lot of us, but in the middle, most of us are still really good intentioned humans. We might have ended up with different flags, but a lot of those wedge issues and a lot of that fragmentation is not driven by the people. It's driven by the extremes looking to co-opt those power bases. But in the middle, we're all here. And so the idea is like, well, how much do we agree? I want to live and I want my family to live. Cool. Do you too? Do you do too? In my preservation of my family, do I extend that same right to you? Do we both buy into our neighborhood or city? Do we have that shared sphere of concern? Awesome. We can agree to agree on this much. How about our nation? Can we agree to agree? How about all the people in the world? Can we agree to agree? How about all living beings? How about the ecosystem, right? And no, that's a step too far. We have different opinions. Cool. Let's just come back to, hey, we all live in the same village. Let's look after that. And so this idea of shared overlap and affirming that shared overlap and saying we can let all the other details be for now, but we've got shit to do here together. And can we reaffirm our overlapping spheres of concern and deepen our connections to our shared humanity and mutuality there? Then that feels like a sliding scale. That means we don't have to solve the culture wars, but we can say the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And right now, the enemy is the bigger collapses we're facing. And as Ben Franklin said, and I'll leave you guys with this, he said in the signing of the Declaration of Independence, he said, all right, gentlemen, he said, we must hang together, or we shall assuredly hang separately. And what that means is that just blows up identity politics of either stripe on any side and says, hey, we can come back to this shit, right? But let's first solve this thing together so that we earn the right to have that kind of agonistic liberalism, of duking out on the finer details later. But for now, we have a common cause that we can and must rally around.